I'm Lauren Summers. I'm Senior Director of Lifelong Learning and Travel at the Yale Alumni Association, and I'm here to welcome you to this Yale Alumni Academy presentation. Yale Alumni Academy is all about lifelong learning programs that happen online, and when we can return to campus, on campus, and when we can return on the road, we'll be offering programs abroad as well. We're all about bringing you the scholarship of Yale's faculty, research, and alumni community in a way that you can interact. So we're really looking forward to having a conversation with you today. We're going to be taking questions and answers, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. But first, I'd like to introduce Professor Michael Heller, Chaired Professor at Columbia Law School, and he's taught at Yale Law School. He is one of the world's leading authorities on ownership, on who gets what and why. His work focuses on helping people see and cure hidden ownership dilemmas, and he has been voted by Columbia students as Professor of the Year. Welcome, Michael. We're delighted to have you.
Great to be here.
Where are you zooming in from, Michael?
Today from New York City.
All right. Sunny and bright New York City, right?
Snowy and cold, delicious.
Not today. And okay, so I will next introduce Professor Jim Salzman. He's Chair Professor with Joint Appointments at UCLA Law School and the UC Santa Barbara School of the Environment. He's a leading authority on environmental protection, and there have been over 110,000 downloads of his articles. He's a popular Yale educational travel study leader and has twice been voted by Duke students as Professor of the Year. He's taught at Yale Law School as well and the School of Environment, and he's an alumnus of Yale College class of 1985. Welcome, Professor Salzman. Delighted to have you back with Yale Alumni Academy.
Thanks so much, Lauren. It really is a treat always to be able to present to Yale alumni. And one of the things I enjoy in particular about these Academy webinars is the active chat function that's going on. In fact, at times it's hyperactive, but I think that's good, right? It shows engagement. And so I'd like to encourage the folks who haven't done these Academy talks before to open your chat window. If you're not familiar with Zoom, it's going to be part of the toolbar on the top or the bottom. It could be, you may have to click on the three dots, but if you open your chat button, it's great because this is a very smart audience, and it's a nice chance to learn from one another as the presentation goes on. So I'm going to start the presentation today by going to the airport. Now I appreciate this.
Oh wait, before you start, can I just jump in with one thing? Since you told people about the chat, which is great, but please don't put your questions in the chat unless you want the other members of the community here to answer your questions, which is always something that will happen. We've got experts in the audience on anything, you can name it. So if you put your questions in the chat, you'll be questioning your fellow attendees here. If you would like the panelists to answer your questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll be getting to those at the end of the presentation, but we will save plenty of time for questions, and I will be watching as we go. So please, no questions in the chat, just the Q&A box. Okay, back to you, Jim.
All right, thanks, Lauren. You can tell that we are a well-oiled operation here. So I want to start by taking us to the airport, and that's a place that many of us have not visited for a while. I appreciate that. But what I'm going to tell you is a true story. In fact, it's a saga. And like all great sagas, there is a hero and there's a villain, but I'm not going to tell you which is which. This guy is James Beach. He's a big guy. He's over 6 feet tall. He's a frequent traveler. He was booked on a crowded United flight from Newark to Denver, and he had a middle seat in row 12. So Beach gets on board, scrunches himself into the seat, and after takeoff, he lowers his tray table. He takes out his laptop, but before he opens his laptop, he takes out these two little plastic clamps that are called knee defenders, and he clamps them to the front of the tray table. These are the plastic clamps that are circled in this photo right here. They cost about 21 bucks on the internet, and they lock the front seat in place. The ad on the internet says that the knee defenders, quote, will stop reclining seats on an airplane so your knees won't have to. So Beach opens his laptop, starts typing, his workplace is assured, plane's flying, all's good. The claims for the knee defender are for real. The passenger sitting in front, she can't recline her seat. She, after a while, realizes the problem. She can't work out a solution. with Beach. And so this is where things start getting saga dramatic. She slams her seat back. The knee defenders pop out. Beach basically, his laptop is now crushed against him. He jams the seat back. He reattaches the clamps. She then takes her cup of water and she throws it in his face. Now, we'll never know how this might have escalated because the pilot at this point changed course to Chicago for an emergency landing. Passengers are removed from the plane, obviously somewhat abashed. It continues to Denver, an hour and 30 minutes late. A similar event took place actually just a week later. It was on a Boston to Paris flight. And these high altitude brawls quickly went viral. The blogosphere was booming with self-righteous claims. Now, fights over reclining seats may seem foolish and maybe even a little stupid, but they reveal a great deal about how the hidden rules of ownership work. And so in the first half of the talk today, we want to pose 3 questions to you. First question is, why is reclining an ownership issue, right? Why is it a conflict? Why are these battles breaking out now? And who's the villain and who's the hero? So let's start with the first question. I mean, why is a fight over whether you can recline an airplane seat or not? Why is that ownership at all? Well, the fight may seem to be simply over this button, but there's a lot more going on. The real conflict here is control over the control of the wedge of space behind the seat. That's this yellow triangle that's shown right there. And the question is, who owns the wedge? Who controls it? The recliner in front or the knee defender in back? And realize, of course, once you think about this, there actually are a lot of similar conflicts that occur in other parts of flying. So you get onto a crowded plane, right? And you sit in the middle of the seat. What's going on with the armrest, right? We all know what's going on with the armrest. There's this sort of unspoken negotiation of jostling, right? So this gadget right here, there's a clever entrepreneur who may have been inspired by the knee defender. They've got a portable armrest that divides it down the middle, so you don't have to worry about that. But think about overhead baggage space, whether the window shade is up or down. Every inch on board can be contested on a plane, and even more so today with concerns over social distancing. This is true not just on airplanes, right? The ownership of scarce stuff is always contested. Ownership invisibly shapes every day of our lives, every minute. These are the rules that decide who gets what and why, whether you stand at the front of the line or the back. It's where you live. It's the medications you take. It's where you drive. Hundreds of times a day, we encounter decisions over who gets what, and these are all decided by a small handful of ownership rules. Now, this is true all over the world. It always has been, it always will be. In this drive to own, it's hardwired. We have deep, deep feelings about who gets what, and this goes way back in evolutionary history. In fact, it's not just humans, right? All species compete for the control of scarce, valuable resources. So think about, obviously it's wintertime now in the East and the Midwest and such, but think about when you go for your springtime walk, you hear the birds chirping, you think how pleasant, how bucolic, isn't nature wonderful? You might think a bit differently if you heard what they're actually saying, right? Essentially, birds often sing to mark their territory. Don't even think about crossing this line. And we humans, we're no different. You spend some time in a playground and you're gonna hear kids shouting one word. And you know what that word is, right? It's mine, 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 right? Mine is one of the first words that kids speak in every culture around the world. And this word only grows in importance as we grow older. Now we hear sayings about ownership all the time, right? So how many common sayings are there about mine? I want to actually put the chat to use now. So what I'd like folks to do in the chat is to come up with and suggest what common sayings do you know about ownership, right? And to prime the pump, here are 2 common ones. First come, first serve, possession 9/10 of the law. Here we go. Finders keepers, what's mine is yours. NIMBY, that's good. Finders keepers. Okay, we're going Spanish here. On the libs, I don't know about that. Early bird gets the worm. Yours, mine, ours, every man for himself. That's right. Good. These are starting to get more complicated. This is what happens to the Yale audience. Okay, these are my toys. Good. Okay. All right, you can keep playing with yourself for a bit. Here's what we came up with, right? And I think your list is better, right? So these are very common sayings, right? You reap what you sow. My home is my castle. Our bodies ourselves. Meek shall inherit the earth. We learn these sayings about ownership at an early age. And our thinking about ownership becomes so ingrained, we don't even realize it. It's like fish that are swimming in water and don't even realize they're surrounded by water. And it's not just in common sayings. So think about the creation legends of Western civilization. So you all know this guy, right? In Greek mythology, what is the catalyst for the birth of civilization? All right. Prometheus steals fire from the gods on Mount Olympus. Now, he pays a terrible price for taking what does not belong to him. His liver is torn out every day by an eagle. So in other words, think of a really bad version of the movie Groundhog Day, right? Every day, every day. But human ownership of fire sparks civilization. And it's the same thing with the Bible. So think about the Garden of Eden story. This is based on ownership rules. God says, make yourself at home, act like you own the place, but do not touch the fruit of the tree of knowledge. It's mine. Now, of course, Adam and Eve ultimately can't resist, right? They take the fruit, but what's interesting is the ownership story doesn't end there. After Adam and Eve take the fruit, trespassing now exists. God says, get out. And God doesn't just change the locks, right? Archangel Michael is placed at the gate and guarding with a flaming sword. You have been evicted, don't come back. They leave, human history begins, and mine has remained up for grabs ever since. Now, when you look at these stories, the Greek creation story, the Garden of Eden, there's an interesting question that comes up, at least to us, which is why does ownership feature so centrally in these creation myths? And we argue it's because at its core, human society exists to help us deal with competing claims to ownership. Might be food, might be water, might be sexual partners, territory. So we don't kill each other too often. Right? Ownership basically creates the scaffolding, the structure for society. So let me return then to the first question. So why is reclining on an airplane seat an ownership conflict? Well, ownership is up for grabs, right? Wherever people want the same thing. Whenever there is not enough to go around, ownership is up for grabs, and that's everywhere and always. It's from the Garden of Eden to the wedge of reclining space behind a seat at 35,000 feet and everywhere in between. So let me turn now to Michael for the second question.
Thanks so much, Jim. So our second question is, why are these battles breaking out now? They didn't used to happen. Planes weren't making these kinds of emergency landings over fights over reclining wedges. No one thought to ask who controlled the wedge. There was plenty of space for everybody. But what's changed is that today, tray table space has become a lot more valuable. Like that, people really need that tray table. People have gotten bigger. What's also happened is that airlines have been shrinking the pitch. The pitch is that horizontal red line there. That's the distance between seats. Not that long ago, it was 35 inches. Today, it's just 28 inches on some airplanes. The key for airlines is that each inch of pitch that they save per row adds up to 6 extra seats they can sell on that airplane. So what airlines are doing is they're squeezing more of us inside that same fixed steel tube. And that means that the wedge is becoming ever more valuable. Passengers are getting angrier at each other because we all assume, hey, that wedge is up for grabs. It's available for me to claim and it's available for you to claim. So it's ambiguous, actually, who controls the wedge. And that ambiguity turns out to be no accident. It's the ambiguity that is the key to solving this first puzzle. Airlines actually do have a rule. And the rule is you have a right to recline. They never announce this rule. They rarely enforce it. And why is that? And the reason is that airlines are some of the absolute masters of ownership design today. So with the reclining wedge, what they're using is an advanced tool of ownership design. And we call this tool deliberate ambiguity. What happens is when ownership is ambiguous, and here it's deliberately ambiguous, airlines know how we are going to respond. What we mostly do is we fall back on being polite, on good manners. We just try to work it out between ourselves, the person in front of us, the person behind us, just like we do when we're like nudging armrests, elbows with the person beside us. So while we're negotiating with each other, getting mad at each other, airlines are profiting. Deliberate ambiguity, this ownership tool, what it lets the airlines do is sell that wedge of space twice on every flight. They sell it on every seat on every flight. They sell it to you to recline and to me for my knees and my laptop. What's even better for the airlines is that all the conflict between us and economy class, it's that conflict that creates a market for the higher price seats up front, the seats with plenty of legroom and no hassle. So the answer to our second question, why are these battles breaking out now? It's because airlines are using an advanced tool of ownership design. They're squeezing us more closely together, and then they're profiting from the conflict that the squeeze creates. And that takes us to our third question, which is who's the villain and who's the hero in this story? Now, to answer this question, we actually have to expand our cast of characters beyond James Beach. He's the character there. So some of you may recall this video. This is from actually exactly a year ago. This is a viral video from February of 2020, just before the pandemic. That's Wendy Williams there in the red sweater. She reclines her seat into the guy in back. You can see on the slide that he is in the last row. He can't lean back. So he is just totally squished. He gets mad and starts banging Wendy's headrest over and over like a metronome. Millions of people watched Wendy's video. The blogosphere lit up this time last year. So we're going to ask you, who's the jerk in this story? Who's in the right? Is it the recliner in front or the guy in back? Is it Wendy or James? So we're going to try something here. We're going to put up a poll and see what you all think. So here's the question, the first poll. Is it okay to recline your airplane seat on a crowded flight if there's someone behind you?
Did the poll come up?
I
got error 1,600. Let me try this again.
I see a poll. Can you all see the poll? Great. Oh, great. Start filling it in. If you can recline, I'm reclining. Or no, just don't do it. So we'll give you maybe 10 more seconds. You don't have to there's no right answer. And it's just your first reaction. If it can recline, I'm reclining, or no, just don't do it. Okay, there's about 100 of you who haven't voted. You don't have to, but we'd like you to weigh in. Maybe wrap it up. Let's wrap it up now. Jim, can you post the poll? Can you all see that? So that's interesting. So in this crowd, we have 55% that say no, don't do it, and 45% that say yes. So for those of you who said, yes, I'm reclining, Ellen DeGeneres, she agrees with you. She says, unless the seat punches you, don't punch back. So about half of you, a little less than half of you are in that camp. 55% are going the other way. Don't lean back. Delta's CEO, he weighed in on this particular battle. Actually, this was on an American Airlines flight. And he says, listen, Wendy should have asked before leaning back. No, just don't do it. Polls usually split about 50-50 on this. And it looks like in our audience, we have almost 500 people voting. And we split, again, almost 50-50. You guys lean slightly towards the no, just don't do it. What that suggests is that you are slightly taller than average crowd. Our average is about 50-50. My guess is that most of you do not doubt your own view. Like, it is clear to you what the answer to this question was. But perhaps at least some of you are a little surprised at how much of the audience disagrees with you, a little less or a little more than half. How can that be? What's going on here? Jim, can you take the poll off the screen? Is that still on there?
It should be. I thought I took it off.
Okay.
It should be off. Is it still on?
Okay. No, I don't know.
It's off.
So thank you. Okay. So what's going on here is that mine seems or may seem pretty obvious and natural to each of us in this context. But really what's going on here is more of a storytelling battle. And remarkably, when things first come to be owned, whatever it is, the wedge of space, fire, the battle is always drawn from just 6 competing stories. For those of you who voted with Wendy, you're asserting what we call the attachment story. The wedge of space is attached to, it belongs to the front seat. The button controls the wedge. It's mine because it's attached to something mine. This idea of attachment, it is one of the world's oldest legal principles. It dates back thousands of years. When you say, my home is my castle, you're invoking attachment. Attachment is what turns your deed of paper, a 2-dimensional sheet of paper, into 3-dimensional control. It's why you own oil and water under your house, airspace above. For those of you who voted with James Beach and knee defenders, you're telling a different story. Possession. Possession is 9/10 of the law. It's mine because I am holding on to it. Possession is just as fundamental as attachment. James is saying, my knees, my laptop, they hold the space, it's mine. And when the seat reclines into it, it feels like it's a trespass. Attachment and possession are two of just the 6 basic stories we all use to claim everything in the world, everything. The third story is first in time, first come, first served. It's mine because I got it first. We use first in time all the time. This is how kids line up for ice cream cones from the good humor truck. This is how countries place satellites in geosynchronous orbit. Fourth story, labor. It's mine because I worked for it. This deep intuition, it goes back to the Bible. You reap what you sow. Reward for labor is the intuition behind why we grant, patents to inventors. It's why we give copyrights to artists. Fifth story is self-ownership. It's mine because it comes from my body. Our bodies ourselves. This is the ownership story that's at stake when we fight over whether we should be able to say, sell a spare kidney, or fights over whether college athletes should be able to profit from their celebrity. These are fights around self-ownership. The last story, finally, family. It's mine because I'm in the family. We may say the meek shall inherit the earth, but the reality of family ownership today is far more troubling. We now live in a country with really surprisingly hidden, separate, and generous rules for the super rich, and a much different, harsher set of rules for the rest of us. So you may say, well, hold on, people sold, or they gave me most of what I own. And being sold something really isn't on this 6-story list. So how does that work? But where did the seller get it from? They got it from someone who sold it to them, and back and back and back. And then all the way back, all ownership traces to some original somebody who is asserting one of these 6 stories. Conflicts arise when you say attachment and I say possession, when you say one story and I reply with another. We each claim the moral high ground. We each insist on the rightness, the naturalness of the story that advances our view. And here's the really cool thing. The reclining seat battle is playing out today all across the economy and with much higher stakes. So with that, let me give it back to Jim. Jim?
Thanks, Michael. More and more, we live our lives on the web. Our internet activities reveal enormous amounts of personal information, what we buy, where we travel, our health status, even how we vote. These data taken together are known as clickstreams. So have you ever wondered why, after you're searching for an airline ticket for a weekend, say to Chicago, suddenly on different websites, these ads just start popping up about Chicago hotel deals, Chicago concerts, things to do in Chicago. But what's happening is the travel website tracked your activities online and sold these to advertisers. Our clickstreams, our likes, our looks, these are worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And the sale of this information powers much of the internet economy. Now, this is often framed in the popular press as a privacy concern. And there are privacy aspects, but it turns on ownership. And one of the central questions for our time is, should you own your clickstream or the tech giants? So we're going to ask now a second poll. And this poll basically is going to ask you, let's see, did it come up? Good. Should Amazon and Facebook own your clickstream? Yes or no? All right, you're getting good at this. These numbers are coming up a lot faster right now. All right, so we're now at about 430 people voting. Let's see if we can get a few more. Okay, one more wait. Okay, I think the numbers are staying pretty stable. So here's what we've got. So this is very interesting, right? So essentially 75% of you said, no, my clickstream is mine. And just 25% of you said no. I'm sorry, 25% of you said the tech giants, the websites you get your clickstream, 75% said no, back off. It's interesting because there's a battle that's playing out right now, right? And it basically engages this conflict. It also demonstrates a much broader dynamic. Whenever any new valuable resource emerges, I'm sorry, did I share the results or not? Can you see them now? Yes, no?
Yes.
Yes.
Good, okay. So whenever any new valuable resource emerges, ownership is up for grabs, right? Because it's not clear who owns it. Websites are taking advantage of this opportunity, and they're just taking the click streams for themselves. Here's the cool thing between stories we just told about the seats and this. The settings obviously could not be more different, but the same stories are at play in the seat reclining and on the web. Facebook and Amazon are telling an attachment story. Their data trackers are like the button on the airplane seat, and our clickstream data attaches to their apps. It's theirs. We can tell, though, a different possession story. We can talk about we possess our data, we're holding on to it. Their trackers are trespassing into our lives. Realize this is possession versus attachment all over again. Metaphorically, Facebook and Amazon are leaning their data trackers into our virtual apps. And the question is, can we create virtual need defenders to keep the tech giants out? Now, interestingly, Europe and California give people some control over the sale of their data. And obviously this audience think that's a great thing. But in most of the world, ownership still is up in the air, and websites take whatever they want. The first step to claiming your clickstream is to realize that you are right now in the middle of a storytelling battle for the fate of your online life. So let's close the circle now on seat reclining. What lessons can we take from this saga? Well, the first is that ownership conflicts are all around us. Whenever people want the same stuff, there is an ownership battle, and that's everywhere. That's always. As resources become scarcer, the storytelling battles become more intense. We use just 6 simple stories, and this is true in every corner of the world. Now a number of you may have noticed, and I saw actually this in the chat stream, we're using Western examples. And certainly different cultures will emphasize one story over another. But here's the thing, everyone is choosing from the same storybook. And finally, ownership is up for grabs. It's always a choice. There is no natural correct answer for who gets what. And with that first half of the presentation as a foundation, we're going to pivot. In the second half of the talk, we want to show you how the hidden rules of ownership really work. So let's think back now to some of our basic sayings. You came up with a lot more than just these, but my home is my castle, possessions 9/10 of the law, first come, first served. These stories are powerful, and they're powerful because they just feel right. They feel natural, fair, simple, but much of what you know about these stories is wrong. In practice, more and more often, the real ownership story is my home is not my castle. Possession is 1/10 of the law, and it's first come, last served. Savvy businesses and governments, they already understand this, and they engineer the 6 simple stories of ownership to steer you to do what they want. So to see how this works, we're going to do a deep dive, and we're going to focus on first come, first served. Michael?
Thanks, Jim. So first come, first served has been the rule for how people initially claim ownership for most of the stuff in the world for most of human history. There's very easy examples to find every day. You go to the deli to get a bagel, you know, it's first in line, step on up, or at the DMV to get a driver's license. If you think about how water is owned in the American West, we use a rule called prior appropriation, which is basically first in time. This is how families pass wealth for most of human history. Inheritance goes to the firstborn son. That's Jacob there, tricking his father Isaac in order to claim his older brother Esau's inheritance. Kids are taught from a very early age to line up, to go first for all sorts of things. And you can see why this story is so powerful. It's intuitive. It's easy to apply, it's easy to enforce. Kids don't need grown-ups to enforce this on the playground. It seems fair. But who is first is not as self-defining as it may appear. This is something we actually drill into our law students. So those of you who are listening today who are lawyers, if you think back to those challenging first year days, what we taught you is first in time is not an empirical fact. First in time feels like an empirical fact. It is not. It never is. First in time is always a story. It is always a choice. Who counts as first and what counts as first? It is always up for grabs. And if you want to see how this really works, we're going to take you now to visit the absolute masters of line management, and that's the Disney company. Disney World markets itself as the most magical place on earth. 58 million visitors go a year. It's the most popular honeymoon destination in America. Disney is so respected at line management that after 9/11, when the federal government needed help with airport security lines, they brought Disney in to figure it out. Do you all know when Disney is not the most magical place on earth? It's when you're waiting 5 hours for a popular ride on a busy day. I mean, listen, sure, you can take your kids to go see the super boring Hall of Presidents. There's no wait there, but Space Mountain, forget about it. It's a victory just to get inside the building, and then there's another long wait to get on the ride. Kids are not known for their patience. So what First in Time did is it created a real headache for Disney. They realized that their long lines were just annoying too many customers. The basic challenge they faced was that they couldn't engineer Magic Kingdom to accommodate any more riders per hour. So the question for Disney was, can we engineer ownership to ease line frustration? And they did. They came up with something called the Fast Pass. Many of you probably have been to Disney World or Disneyland and used this. What it lets you do is it lets you skip the regular endless line for a fixed entrance time, so maybe a short wait or no wait at all later in the day. And each family gets up to 3 of these passes for rides. And what it does is it eliminates for the family some of the line waiting for those families that can plan ahead. So for kids who don't want to take this Seven Dwarfs mine train, they're not so grumpy anymore. They're happy instead. Basically, it's win-win. But in particular, Disney wins. So what Fast Pass does is it lets Disney get grumpy families moving around and spending money, not angrily waiting in line. It's no longer old-fashioned First in Time, but this change to the Fast Pass, it feels open, it feels accessible. Everyone can get a Fast Pass if you just plan ahead a little bit. The question for Disney was, can they do even better? Can they design First in Time to profit directly from the line waiting hassle the company has created? And it's here that Disney took the next step, what we think of as the genius step in ownership design. There are a lot of wealthy people who have more money than time. And for them, what Disney created is called the private VIP tour. It's kind of like a super duper Fast Pass. It lets you skip every line on every ride all day long for $3,000 to $5,000, depending on the season. So if your family wants to ride Splash Mountain 5 times in a row with no waiting, knock yourselves out. But for Disney, this new version of First in Time increased profits. They figured out how to make money from the long lines they had created. It's the same as airlines creating a market for business class seats by offering an alternative to the misery and economy. But there was a catch for Disney. If Disney visibly moves too many wealthy families to the front, they risk angering the many thousands of families that are waiting patiently in line. So what Disney does is they discreetly assign a guide to help each VIP family get to the front without the people waiting knowing. So for some rides, what the guides will do is bring families in through the exit. That's actually what's happening on this slide. The tour group, the family is coming in the exit of this ride. So the problem for Disney is that old-fashioned First in Time, it just left too much money on the table. So Disney changed who counts as first, starting with the Fast Pass and then with VIP tours. Families that are still patiently standing in line cannot tell anything has changed. They never realize that the real rule has become first come, last served. And it's not just Disney that's re-engineering ownership. First come, last served is quietly becoming standard practice across the economy. Jim?
Thanks, Michael. So we've already seen how airlines are masters of ownership engineering with the reclining seats, right, with that wedge of space. So it's no surprise they know how to profit from redefining first come, first serve. Now, when I was young, we used to get to the airport and we'd arrive early. And you could actually line up for economy. And if you got there earlier, you got earlier on the flight. Now, it's no help at all, right? It depends what level of semi-precious stone or metal you are. And I have to tell you, when I learned that I was ruby a few years ago, I was thrilled. So I was a bit shocked when I learned that I was one of the last people to get on board. I mean, whoever thought ruby would be so worthless? I mean, what's that about, right? So it turns out that airlines create these rules to maximize customer loyalty. Ruby is nothing. If you want to get to the head of the line, you have to fly off and you have to pay full fare. And it's not just businesses. Governments also redefine first in time. So on the highway, right, the fast lane, that's generally available to whomever moves into it. It's first come, first served. But in many cities during rush hour, that's no longer the case. They have transformed the fast lane into so-called HOV lanes, high occupancy vehicle. Now, these are often reserved for carpools or for electric vehicles. Why is that? Well, they want to promote cleaner air. They want less pollution from the daily commute. So they've changed who counts as first for the environment, but not always. Right? Disney saw ways to make money from its lines, and governments don't like leaving money on the table either. So if you want to get from Northern Virginia to downtown DC quickly during rush hour, you want to be a solo driver, you're a gas guzzler, no problem. I've got a fast lane for you for 30 bucks. All right, this is known as congestion pricing. And it's similar in concept to the VIP pass, but here everyone can see it. Here's what I want you to focus on. This is the key, one of the key points. Holders of valuable resources are using ownership like a remote control to steer us to do what they want. Disney redefined first twice. The Fast Pass gets families out of line and steers them to spend money on Mickey merchandise and giant turkey legs. The VIP Pass steers the one percenters to pay thousands. The low-value customers who are left waiting in endless lines, they're the only ones who are actually still playing by the old rules of first come, first serve. Airlines, they define first for boarding priority in order to encourage brand loyalty. Fly us more, you'll get on earlier. Highway departments, they use first for HOV lanes to promote carpooling, low emission cars to improve the air quality or to raise money. Here's the thing, in all of these cases, the ownership rules are operating as social engineering. The businesses and governments, the owners, are redefining first to direct our behavior, and they're steering us to get what they want. People may still feel they're playing by first in time, but as Michael said, the real rule today is much more often first come, last served. Now, engineering first in time is not just done by the owners of the scarce resource. In fact, anywhere you see a long line, a long popular line, creative entrepreneurs can profit by re-engineering first in time. And here is a great example, and the lawyers in the crowd will probably recognize this. This is the Supreme Court. It offers the best free show in DC. At least law professors think it's the best free show in DC. Smithsonian's not bad, but the Supreme Court, you can sit only steps away from the justices. There are just 100 free seats available for the public. Now that is a scarce resource. The entrance is first come, first serve. There's no cutting. People line up well ahead for big cases. Minutes before the doors open, though, a very strange thing happens. These ragged-looking people at the front of the line, they exchange places with well-dressed folks carrying briefcases. You can actually see the same thing with lines for public seats at congressional hearings where important laws are being written. What's going on here? Well, welcome to the line standing industry. Linestanding.com and other companies like it charge clients up to $6,000 to get in first. They pay minimum wage to the hired line standers who wait for days in the rain and cold, well before the general public who would like to attend. This is now a standard expense for lawyers and for lobbyists. If you go to DC and you want to see a big Supreme Court argument, the odds are you can't get in because somebody has already paid a line stander for the free seats. It's booming business in the private sector too. You want to be in front of the line for a hit Broadway show, for the new iPhone launch, for the Macy's parade, pay up. One hopeful Shark Tank contestant paid so he could avoid waiting 43 hours for his audition. So I want to ask you in our final poll, how do you react to paid line standing? Do you think it's undemocratic? Do you think it's unfair? Or maybe you think it's the market at its best. It's creating jobs to meet demand. So let me launch this poll. All good, you can see it? There we go. All right, we've got 70% of people have voted. Let's just give it another few seconds. Okay, Michael, I'm going to pass this over to you. The numbers are pretty much evened out. You can see the results?
Cool. So roughly 2/3 of you think that you shouldn't be paying line standers, and about 1/3 of you think this is okay. There isn't a right answer here or a wrong answer. There's no law on lines. That's actually one of our messages, which is that law is really often quite overrated. people go through hundreds of ownership disputes every day, and you never deal with the law. And that's very much true on lines. When we gave this poll to Jim's students at the Bren School of the Environment, they came out exactly where you guys did. 2/3 were against line standing. When we gave this poll to my law students, 2/3 came out the other way, actually. 2/3 were in favor of paid line standing. So I guess you guys are more like of an eco crowd than a sort of law businessy crowd. That's one way to find that out. It's actually kind of cool. Anyway, first in time, it is always a choice, and it always boils down to customs and norms, what feels right. But this shift to first come, last served, it isn't just about money. There are also real democratic values at stake here about access. So first in time, old-fashioned first in time, rewards those with the time needed to get there first, which is a currency that we all hold in equal measure. We each have 24 hours in our day. First come, last served rewards wealth. It favors those who have less time, but can pay for the time of others. What we're seeing with first in time quietly across the economy is that owners are rewriting this story from time to money, from equality to privilege, from first to last. So I guess one thing for you guys to sort of think about next time you're in a long line for some high value item, maybe ask yourself, are those ahead of you being paid to wait? And what does that mean for you as a consumer and as a citizen? I'm going to give you one more example. It's another everyday example for anyone of you who lives in a big city. And it snaps into focus this one once you understand how the rules of ownership work. This is the world of food trucks. Normally, public parking on city streets is first come, first served. So food trucks arrive early and they park in prime downtown spots. Food trucks offer recent immigrants often a route to establishing to creating their own small businesses. Downtown bricks and mortar restaurants do not like food trucks. They're threatened by their popularity. They're mad that the trucks don't pay rent. They pay lower taxes. So restaurants lobby city councils all across the country to change parking rules. And the way that they do that is by redesigning what counts as first so they can eliminate competition. Food trucks say, listen, first in time means, first to park today. And restaurants say, no, first in time means something different. We were here first before the food trucks arrived at all, and we should be able to prevent food trucks from parking nearby. So city councils in a bunch of cities, Chicago, Baltimore, many others, were persuaded by the restaurants, and they now prohibit food trucks from parking within 200 feet of traditional restaurants. And what that means, more or less, is pretty much no parking anywhere downtown. So redefining first was super profitable for restaurants. It was devastating for immigrant entrepreneurs and for up-and-coming chefs. Chicago today has a 200-foot parking ban. The city only has 70 food trucks in all of Chicago and a super boring street food scene, which those of you who are from Chicago, I hope will confirm. Portland, Oregon, which is the slide shown now, is about a quarter of the size of Chicago. It has no parking restrictions. Portland, Oregon has about 500 food trucks. It is one of the most vibrant food scenes in all of America. So the next time you're walking downtown, and along with noticing who's waiting in lines, also notice the presence or the absence of food trucks. Very small, tiny, hidden changes in how we define first shapes the entire food economy of a city. And this is always true. We always engineer first in time. It is not a fact. It is a story. And it's such a powerful story because it first feels natural and fair. And it is always up for grabs. And we can see this right now with battles over access to the COVID vaccine. Everyone agrees, frontline health workers, they go first. But after them, then who? Elderly, prisoners, teachers. In New Jersey today, smokers get priority. Each group defines first to promote its particular set of values, just like the bricks and mortar restaurants defined first to keep out food truck competition. Thing is, COVID vaccines do not administer themselves. Owners always face a choice to figure out who should be at the front of the line. Actually, one last point on the COVID vaccine. The guy who was waited in line for 43 hours for the Shark Tank audition, he's now totally re-engineered his line standing business. His whole line standing business today is waiting in line for people to get COVID tests and vaccines. It's really an impressive form of first in time entrepreneurship. So let's move on. We showed you this slide a little earlier in the talk. And what you see here is one little girl here is shouting, mine, I'm holding on to it. And the other one is screaming back, no, mine, I had it first. And now you know that what's going on here is more than just a toddler screaming match. It's a storytelling battle between I'm holding on to it, possession, and I had it first in time. This is a battle between two of the 6 simple stories everyone uses to claim everything. And what's remarkable is that businesses and governments are using the exact same stories that these kids are shouting on the playground. And they're using those same stories to decide who can recline, who can drive in the fast lane, who owns your clickstream, who gets vaccines first. Ownership is a form of social engineering. So in this last part of the talk, we focused on a shift in one of the stories to first come, last served. But savvy owners have figured out how to turn all 6 of the ownership stories upside down to get you to do what they want. So for example, online today, Amazon and Apple have redefined what online possession means when you download a book or a movie. Possession online is no longer 9/10 of the law. It's barely 1/10 of the law. What it means is that today online, there's a big gap between what you feel you own, possession, and what you actually own, which is very little. Sometimes it's governments turning these stories upside down, not necessarily for profit, sometimes to serve the common good. So our very best solutions for climate change, this is an area Jim works on, is to redesign attachment stories. Our very best chance for reining in America's new wealth aristocracy is by tweaking our family ownership story. So with that, I actually want to give it back to Jim to bring us home on the talk.
All right, so here's the thing. Once you know where to look, the hidden rules of ownership explain so many puzzles all around us every day. So we want to leave you musing about a few of these puzzles. So why, for example, does HBO encourage, not just tolerate, but encourage illegal password sharing? How is it that we can sell some body organs, but not others? Why, for example, is selling blood plasma or eggs or sperm okay, but selling a spare kidney is not? How has Amazon engineered the buy now button so the company gains an unearned premium every time you download a book or a movie? And how is it that South Dakota has become the world's leading money haven? South Dakota crushes Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. And it's all about ownership rules. What does this mean for the rise of America's new aristocracy of inherited wealth? These 4 puzzles and 100 more may seem unrelated, but they all snap into focus once you look at them through the lens of ownership. We want to leave you today with a challenge, and that is to pick any newspaper, today's, tomorrow's, next week's. We are 100% confident that a front page story will turn on ownership. Well, how can we be so sure about predicting the news? We don't have a crystal ball. It's because ownership is the scaffolding society uses to structure every struggle over the things we want. And that's a lot of things. Once you see how ownership really works, you can't unsee it. And once you can see it, you can begin to be a more effective advocate for change as a parent, as a consumer, and as a citizen. So those are the remarks that we want to share with you today. As Lauren pointed out at the outset, this is a book talk. I can promise you it is hard to launch in COVID. Our launch date actually is in less than 2 weeks on March 2nd. We hope some of you will consider making mine yours. If you want to, there are a few options. Yale Bookstore has 20 copies that are actually signed. So if you're local to New Haven or you want to get a signed copy, you can get in touch with them. You can go to our book website, mindthebook.com. We've got a bunch of buy now, pre-order now buttons, or you can go to your local local bookstore, which is always a good thing to do. I should note that on our website, we also have some very cool 2-minute videos. You get to see my backyard and Michael's living room. We have a free downloadable ebook, and there's more to explore. And obviously, we encourage you to engage with social media. We're posting new content almost every day. But enough of the plug for the book. We're very grateful to have shared these ideas with you. And let me turn it over to Lauren.
Hey, thank you, Jim. I'll actually give a second plug for the book. For those of you who don't know, the professors who come and give these talks for us and give of their time don't ask for or receive anything from us in return. And classes is different. When you're taking a class with these professors, and some of you may have taken Professor Salzman's class on water rights, which was excellent. Those classes you pay for and professors are paid, but we really appreciate you all sharing your time with us and giving us this wonderful talk. And obviously a ton of preparation went into it. So very happy to support your book. And thank you for telling us how we can find it. There are a lot of questions in the chat, and right now we're at 35 questions. So I do believe we probably have about another half an hour for those of you who want to stick around and talk questions and answers. Please do. I'm going to get through as many of your questions as I can. I found some really interesting themes that came up in the questions. And I think one of the ones that came up most frequently was this idea of societies where there is a sense of communal fate of this. So there's two different ways to spin it, right? There are societies where there's an understanding of communal identity, communal fate. And then there are societies, and ours is one of them, where there's an understanding of some things being communal possessions. So I just wonder if you could, the first question was just looking cross-culturally at those societies where there's an understanding of communal fate, communal identity. How does this idea of ownership play out differently?
All right, so Michael, you've written quite a bit about this actually, so maybe you can take it.
Well, there's three basic values that animate how we own things generally underneath all these stories. So we care a lot about our personal freedom, about our autonomy. We also use ownership to, like we said in this talk, to steer people around for utility purposes. The third basic reason we deal with ownership is exactly this question, which is fostering community. And that community can be as small as our family. It can be a tribe or a clan. It can be a nation. But ownership, property, is the core for many of our identities. A lot of what marriage is about is common management of the resources within the marriage. And that's the same is true all the way up to a nation, managing the national resources. So that family story, the sixth story that we talked about today, has many different valences, many different components. So we focused on like the nuclear family, but it also extends out in some cultures to a clan or a tribe or to a nation. So it can be, as you move into the family, you move from what we call mine to ours. And when you move from mine to ours, you get a more complicated set of relational questions. But community is absolutely at the core of ownership everywhere, not just between you and your spouse or you and your children, but also up to you and your nation. So mine as a part of ours is a very fundamental part of what we mean by ownership.
So I noted that Joanne asked about the commons, and she references Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize work on the subject of the commons. Just wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, this is an area that both Jim and I have written quite a lot about. Much of my previous book was called The Gridlock Economy, which is about the opposite of the commons. So so Elinor Ostrom noticed a phenomenon which is true in every corner of the world, which is that when too many people have access to the same resource, they tend to overuse it. If too many people can graze cattle on one field, the field is destroyed, but through overuse. That's called the tragedy of the commons. And Elinor Ostrom helped identify some of the conditions under which commons resources would not be tragic. That was her big contributions. What won her the Nobel Prize was noticing that people often have mechanisms for working together informally on commons resources, for fishing resources, for water resources, all over the world. There's tens of thousands of examples. So there's many, many ways that people are able to work together outside of law, through family ties, through church ties, by dealing with each other over and over, to basically avoid having resources be overused, even though individually each person benefits from the use and collectively they don't. We talk about this actually a fair bit in the book as one of the core driving principles of ownership law in the world, and also for the stories that we are telling, particularly the stories about attachment. Jim, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it's equally a problem for fisheries, for groundwater, where there's common resources that can be overused. And it's the attachment principle and how that basically is made sort of operational that we're able to deal with that either through the government or, as Michael said and Elinor Ostrom wrote about, through informal arrangements.
So I want to go to, well, there's two questions that follow on to that I think are interesting. I'm I'm not sure how to say this name, Jamie asked if there are fewer interpersonal ownership conflicts in societies where there's more communal property or ownership structures that are considered more commons.
I spent many years working. I was part of the first team always to parachute into socialist countries the day after the socialist government fell. There was from 89 to 94, I worked for the World Bank in DC. The World Bank is a complicated place. There's lots that's terrible about it, but lots that's actually quite good about it. And part of what I did when I was there is I was part of that group. Whenever they shot a dictator, the new market reform leaders would say, how do we join the European Union? So if you're in Hungary, Poland, Albania, Romania, wherever, the question was, how do we move from this collective approach to ownership to more private property? And it turns out that under the collective approach of socialism, at least as it was practiced in Eastern Europe, there was vicious, terrible, brutal struggles over resources. It was no different. Now you may think, well, how about something more like an Israeli kibbutz, where they're all bound by an ideological and sort of almost spiritual tie to each other, or like a monastery where they are literally bound by a spiritual tie to each other around the commons resource. It's still the same stories on the kibbutz, in socialism, in the monastery, and there's still a lot more intense battles over who gets what than you might appear on the surface, even in the monastery.
Okay, that covers a few questions that were asked, so that's great. I want to piggyback on that one, just still on this theme of societies where communal understanding is different from a understanding of individual ownership. Joe asked if you can speak on why and when Anglo-Saxon common law established that the water flowing in a river or a stream belonged in any given stretch to the owner of the bank, of the river bank. And by contrast, European law seems to view water as a common social rather than a private good. And I want to add to that, Jim, a comment that you made in another presentation, which talks about this idea that there are indigenous groups that are now advocating for river or stream to have its own personhood when it comes to ownership rights. So I wonder if you could throw that in the mix of this question about Anglo-Saxon common law.
Yeah, so I can talk about the more modern. I have no idea about the history. Michael, I don't know if you know that or not. That's a no.
No.
Okay.
I'm not enough to be useful for this crowd.
Yeah, right. It's actually one thing about talking to a Yale group is you can't fake it, because there's going to be someone in the audience who knows the answer. So what Lauren was referring to is a very interesting development, legal development, that's been taking place in a few places around the world now, which is to try to give legal personhood to actual natural objects, whether it is a river or a lake. And of course, you know, this goes back in other cultures. It's actually not unusual at all, right? The idea of spiritual sacred places that have their own special protections. But in our law system, we don't really have that. One of the big questions that comes up when you try to grant legal personhood to a river, for example, is kind of the Lorax question, right? The Lorax, as you may recall, says, "I speak for the trees," right? Well, who speaks for the river? Now, sometimes that's not an issue, right? Because if the river could speak, the river would certainly say, you know, don't pollute me to the point that everything in my river body becomes dead, right? But that's not actually where these decisions are taking place. Environmental law and protection generally happens on the margins. And that's where things get difficult. And so in those instances where personhood has been given to rivers, and the most famous recent one is in New Zealand, there's a very complicated question that goes along with that, which is what process are we going to use to basically express what the rights mean? And so usually there's some sort of guardian who's appointed to speak on behalf of the river, sort of guardian ad litem, as we would have for young kids. But this is an area I think it's going to be happening more and more and more. There's no question, and I see it in my teaching. The up and coming generations are much more attuned to the idea of the natural world being more aggressively protected. And this is a good example of that.
All right, I want to go to Philip's question next. He asked, how do real estate taxes and utility fees redefine the idea of ownership? Government lands and resources and also airwaves are claimed by government as public to facilitate licensing and help organize limited resources and prevent chaos. Is this a fair thinking model? should the Fairness Doctrine have been terminated?
Michael?
So there's two separate questions there. One is what you owe to the state for the privilege of owning land. That actually does trace back to the old Anglo-Saxon rules where when you owned land, you held it from the king. It was a relationship. You had to provide a mounted knight. You had to say prayers for a particular person in exchange for holding land from the king in medieval England. That notion of that relationship, the landlord and you as the tenant, evolved today into ownership. And the state stands in the place of the king, and those feudal services, a prayer or a mounted knight, now has evolved into real estate taxes. If you think about every single piece of land in America, every single piece, without a single exception, every single piece of private land in America is attached to some public property, attached to a river, navigable river, attached to a road. There is no such thing as private property in this country in isolation. It all exists in a matrix of publicly owned property. And to support that is where this notion of owing taxes on your land comes from, historically from the king, and then practically today because of this matrix. You asked a second question, which has to do with Fairness Doctrine about the airwaves. That's a different issue. So historically, the airwaves were understood as a public resource. And that is often the case when resources first emerge. They're sometimes claimed by the state, and that was certainly the case for public airwaves. They were allocated in a particularly dumb way. They were allocated for decades to television stations that had very low value, or often just left them, very low value uses, or left them idle. Only in the recent years have we started to reallocate spectrum to more valuable uses, basically for cell phones. So we have, so there's a big shift in ownership on the airwaves. You asked about the Fairness Doctrine. So that also has the parallel there is that there's certain obligations that you have when you have this public resource, even if you pay money for it, even if you buy it at auction, you have certain obligations to the public that come with this shared or public resource. We commit it to your private benefit because you're going to bring us cell phones, and we expect not just payment, but certain obligations as well. And it's there that the Fairness Doctrine, the notion that sometimes broadcasters have to publish opposing views to their own when they take a position on a public issue. So for both of these, the question gets at is the underlying core social obligation dimension of private property, even in the most private and absolute sense that you can think of. It's still always in this matrix of public.
I think we saw a really interesting application of that recently with the censoring of the president on these platforms like Twitter, and there's this question that raised of should that be a decision that's in the hands of the CEOs of these companies who speaks on their platforms and who gets censored. And it brings us into this era where public airwaves are no longer the primary means of distribution for information, right? And that's speaking to the point that you just made, Michael, about, when it's a public utility, it's considered to be shared. But Twitter is not a public utility. So someone can decide and be the owner of who speaks on Twitter and who doesn't. And I think it's a huge area that's going to open up to debate.
You're absolutely at the cutting edge of ownership. Like, who owns your Twitter stream? All that stuff that you write on Twitter. Who owns your Facebook page? Does Facebook own it? Do you own it? Who owns your photos? They use your photos to train AI algorithms for facial recognition. Can they do that? So we're surfing right at the edge of ownership. And that's right where the ambiguity is often most powerful and most important. It's where the person who jumps ahead, who claims it first, the Facebooks and the Amazon, get the advantage. So who owns your TikTok videos? All of these are very much at the moment up for grabs. But it's not the answer is up to us collectively. There isn't just a natural or correct answer to who owns your Facebook page. We get to make a choice about it. They may say one story, we can say another. We're not disempowered from making a choice about how all of this stuff is owned all day.
That really, sorry to interrupt, Michael, that really is one of the main reasons we wrote the book, to make clear, to this audience and to the readers, ownership is not a given, right? The websites, they have their story, but we've got our story too. And there's no reason our story is less persuasive, but it's important to realize we have a story.
Well, I think that, you're getting at something that is also right on the edge of where the law defines things and where ethics defines things. And there was a really interesting conversation happening in the chat about ownership of DNA material, sperm versus eggs versus organs, and who gets to decide what's sold and what's the value. And it's a second conversation happening on the COVID vaccine distribution. So I wonder if, and I'm just putting together about 20 questions into one here, if you could speak to where these are ethical decisions and where they're legal decisions, particularly when it comes to something like who gets a COVID vaccine first and what their status is in society in terms of whether they're an elite position versus a regular class versus an underclass. There were a lot of questions on that, so I've just summarized them all into one.
Michael, you want to start?
Oh, well, either way. You guys, this is great. This is why we wrote the book. We love this stuff. This is such an important issue. And we just want you guys to not feel disempowered from fighting about this and from arguing about this and from making a claim on this issue. So one of the places that we see a lot is, I don't know if you guys have done this. Have you ever done the swab, the 23andMe DNA swab? You swab it and you send it in and they send you back, oh, you're 43% from here and 27. When you do that, you think, wow, I'm the consumer, I'm the customer. I swabbed and I sent it in. But the reason that the DNA 23andMe is so cheap is that you're not actually the consumer there. You're the product. They basically give away the DNA testing essentially for free, because what they're doing is they're collecting your DNA to assemble into databases to sell it to pharmaceutical companies for basically drug development, and to insurance companies to figure out what to charge you for insurance. It's already the case today that virtually everyone listening today, there's almost 600 people who started out, virtually every single one of you is personally identifiable from DNA that somebody else has sent in. They can track you from your cousin's DNA. And they can figure out your longevity. They can figure out all sorts of stuff about you. How on earth is that possible, right? It's because we have an absolute Wild West today in genetic DNA. And that's true for, again, any new resource. It's up for grabs. And the DNA companies, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, they're basically putting their flag, just like the explorers put their flag on islands, they're putting their flag on your DNA. The reason it's so cheap is that you are the product. And it's the same with COVID, right? There's absolutely no natural or correct answer. What the law is on this is just an artifact of the choices that we've made. Like we said at the start of the talk, law is massively overrated. This is something that's very hard for us to get across to our law students, how overrated law is. All of you have found something and lost something. And I guarantee in this audience, not one of you has been involved in a lawsuit around lost and found. You've all stood in lines your whole lives, and you're standing in line now for COVID, and no one knows what the law is on this. The real law, the law in practice, is what we actually do. It's not what the law is on the books. 99.99% of ownership disputes are just everyday life. It's how you get through your day all day long. And the COVID vaccine is another one of those. It's just, you're telling a story, someone else is, it is 100% up for grabs. And the ethics of it are, that is the story. The law is the artifact, not the other way around.
And with COVID, I can see it playing out right now, and it really plays well into the point we're trying to make with the book. I mean, the fact is the owner of the resource, in this case, it's the government with COVID vaccines, they've got to decide what value they are going to optimize. And in a sense, it's no different than Disney, right? Disney holds a scarce resource. Who gets first to go on Space Mountain? They decide to design their lines, the rules for the lines, to optimize essentially more people shopping, having time to shop in Disney, and to get more revenue from the VIP pass. What we would call for, and we're actually going to write an op-ed on this, is that for the COVID debate, to be very clear about the values that really matter. And once you identify the core values, then who gets to the front of the line is actually very straightforward. The problem right now is that the values that matter are getting sort of lost in this back and forth, versus smokers versus prison workers versus this, instead of saying, these are the core values that we're going to start with. And then from that, we'll decide who gets to the front of the line. Ownership, in other words, we think can clarify difficult issues. It won't answer the issue, but it can clarify what the real question is.
Okay, I'm gonna jump on that with a question that I think is really interesting. It draws from recent news headlines. I'm sure you all have seen about Bhutan, and the incidence rate of COVID in Bhutan being virtually nothing, and them sort of analyzing that and saying it's a factor of the communal action that has been taken by the Bhutanese government and by the citizens there, and the culture that undergirds that. So when you talk about values, I wonder if you can speak to that story. Victoria has asked this question, the sense of ownership versus the common good, and the common good, the idea behind the common good, perhaps being able to call that patriotism in a way, if you look at the Bhutanese story, versus your own individual freedom. And so Victoria is asking that question.
What a wonderful question. Thank you, Victoria. And that's absolutely right. So one of the things that's most striking to us about ownership is the way that it creates isn't the right word, the way that it reflects and creates, sort of goes both ways, different cultures in different places. So when I was in Japan last time, I lost something, and it turned out, I lost a wallet, and it turned out I was actually turned into the local police station. And that's going to be true almost universally in Japan. There's a very specific culture around lost and found, and it's different from the culture here in New York City when I lose something. And that's going to be true for along every aspect of different resource battles. And the COVID one is, in this context, very much another resource battle where you have very distinctive cultures. And part of what's so interesting, traveling, and for me, working in many different countries, is sort of seeing how that local culture interacts with the same set of stories. Because they work from the same set, but then the very sort of community-oriented culture in Bhutan just looks very different in how those stories play out. And the COVID is a very good example. Jim, do you want to add on to that?
No, it's just that, shared cultures, shared norms, those go beyond ownership, right? Ownership, I basically sort of subsumed within that. But there's no question. I agree with what Michael said. The Bhutanese experience is part of a larger set of shared norms, and those shape which stories really matter in terms of how we're going to think about first come, first served, for example, with a COVID vaccine, or mask wearing, which I assume was universal in Bhutan as well.
Okay, I want to go to Caitlin's question next. She says, I'm super curious about urban development and Nimbyism. I would love to know if you have ideas for tweaking how people think about ownership to encourage the creation of more housing.
Should I take that? So I actually teach about exactly this issue. And one of the things that's fun about teaching land use is that Nimbyism stands for not in my backyard. And it's the principle basically that people just don't like things built near them. And what they really mean by that is they don't want people who are poorer than them or of a different color from them. So basically Nimbyism in practice usually ends up being both either a class or a racial set of about exclusion. So there's now growing up in a lot of America, I think it should be stronger, as a movement for YIMBYism. Yes, in my backyard. Yes, bring in more diverse people. Yes, bring in more dense housing. Actually, this is an area where Jim and I haven't talked about, but many of the people in my view, on the wrong side of Nimbyism, people sort of against urban development, against growth, against affordable housing, usually frame it in terms of environmental claims. They usually say it's bad for the environment to build more densely here. I think the most eco-friendly places in the world are big cities. Much less intense energy use per capita in a big city. We need a tremendous amount more urban development. In New York City, the average height of buildings has been going down for the last 50 years. It's actually shocking. It should be going up. So the basic strategy here is something that some states have tried. So for example, California is at the cutting edge of this with a law they passed last year, SB 50, where they try to basically override local Nimbyism, local communities that are really about exclusion, and try to say, we're going to force you to take more of a share, allow people to build more housing, more in-law apartments, more two-story housing, more duplexes, basically make more construction a matter of right. So neighbors can't fight against basically more development. I think that should be the rule everywhere.
So one of the fun things about co-authoring a book is that I come at this from a very different angle, which is that Nimbyism sometimes really is, not just a cover for keeping out different races or different demographics, but someone doesn't want a highway exchange next door or a subway light rail station next door. Where I see a lot of this right now in my environmental work is notions about the Green New Deal or Biden's New Deal, or whatever you want to call it. And that is that, if you view climate change as an existential threat, then we have to put in a lot more renewables very quickly. That is going to run up against our environmental laws. All right, there may be endangered species where you want to put a large solar field. And there's a law called NEPA that can slow things down as well. And so I think we're actually facing a reckoning. And it comes back to one of the points we make in the book, which is in order to manage that reckoning, we've got to be much clearer about what our values are, right? Because you can't have a free lunch, right? You're going to have to give on something. If you want to speed up the creation of infrastructure for renewables or for hardening to deal with climate change, you're going to have to give way on some other protections. And it's not a nice choice. But I think that's where we're heading. And again, that's why one of the main things we keep coming back to is to surface what the real values are at stake. There's no question Nimbyism is often used as a cover for other reasons, but sometimes Nimbyism really is straightforward Nimbyism.
Okay, I want to go to Beth's question because I think it dovetails on some points that, Michael, that you made. Beth says, I'd love to hear how ownership ideas intersect with racial justice ideas, particularly with respect to Black Americans who were once owned and have since emancipation found the rules of ownership slanted away from them. And someone else actually asked about modern slavery, which is a different topic, but you know, it gets to people being owned and resources being distributed, and NIMBYism is sometimes a factor with how that works. So I'm just curious if you guys can comment on that one.
You can't overstate how important the legacy of slavery is to the reality of ownership today. The connection is just, it is so direct. It is the absolute founding principle or tragedy or original sin of American ownership, which was the practice of slavery. And it is still the case today. That some of the listeners here today may not realize, we actually now today in America have two actually different legal systems that apply in family ownership. There's a system that applies for the super rich, almost all white, and a system that applies quite differently for the poorest of the poor, and in particular for poor Black farmers. So one of the things we talk about in the book is just the difference in how wealth gets accumulated in America based on, we know about the vast racial and wealth inequality that emerges from the power of race discrimination. We see it in tax policy. We see it in educational disparities. But where we don't always recognize it is that it's actually baked into the actual legal system that we all operate under in a very concrete way, so that we actually have these two very different. We mentioned the South Dakota example. That's where, if you're super rich, you already know about South Dakota. That's where you stash your money so you don't have to pay taxes on it. So you can stiff your ex-spouse or your children or your business partners, whoever you need to stiff. If you're a poor Black farmer in America, you basically have a very different set of ownership rules, a much harsher set. But one of the things we talk about in the book is the 98% drop in African-American land ownership in this country over the last century. And it didn't just happen because of race discrimination, although it is also that. It didn't just happen because of racist violence, although it is also that. It happened substantially because of changes in what are called partition rules about how kids inherit from their parents on a farm situation. And that partition rules have been just devastating for the African-American community in terms of destroying wealth creation over the course of 100 years. So we view this as absolutely at the core of the American law of ownership today. It's one of the main themes that we deal with in the book, and it's one that is sort of through all of our lives, I think, every day.
Okay, people had a lot of questions about the 6 ownership rules. And they also were really ignited by the picture of the 2 girls arguing on the playground in the sandbox there. And basically people kind of commented that points to a 7th ownership rule, which is the might is right concept. And so I think Steve said it very well. Isn't privilege a 7th ownership rule? People either use force or power to just take what they feel should be theirs. I wouldn't, normally put such a question out, except for that it came up multiple times. So I wonder if you guys have comments on that.
Jim?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, to my mind, there's a lot wrapped up in there. So, one response to might makes right is theft, right? We have laws, or mugging, right? We have laws saying, no, might doesn't make right for ownership. Now, obviously, might makes right can be subtler. through changes to the tax code or the partition and such. So my first response would be the law says no, might makes right is actually not a core justification for ownership. You could, though, argue that current possession justifies might makes right. And so one of the things we talk about that's not exactly on point here, but I think is fascinating and is related, is a whole question of what about someone who owns a piece of art that was taken by, for instance, from Jews by the Nazis or by Native Americans. And we have sort of an intuitive sense about that. But what if the president of Iraq or the parliament of Iraq said, we want the gate from Babylon that's in the Metropolitan Museum returned to Iraq? I think most of us would have very different intuitive reactions to that. And at a certain point, might makes right, I guess, with the passage of time, does convey ownership. So I would say I think it's a very insightful point. I wouldn't say it's a freestanding justification. I'd say it sort of interweaves among many of our stories. Michael?
So what ownership does is, I mean, when you think about ownership around the world historically, or many of the countries I've worked in, what you have is a series of superseding historical injustices, genocide on top of genocide. And in any ownership scheme, so in America today, when you trace ownership back in North Carolina, it traces back to the Trail of Tears, the dispossession of Native Americans. If you trace it back in everywhere, it's going to trace it back ultimately to some genocide or some dispossession. So in that sense, might makes right is right. But in America, when the courts had to figure out who owned America in the early 1800s, this is one of the first cases every law student learns, a case called Johnson versus Macintosh. The question was, who owns this piece of land in America? One person said, I bought it from Native Americans. Another one said, no, I bought it from the US government. And which of those is the origin of ownership in America? So it's sort of a might makes right story, but that's never the way it plays out in law. That's part of why we say each of these stories is up for grabs. So the US Supreme Court in 1823 said, the settlers were there first. So America is owned by the people who were there first. And who was there first? The European settlers. Well, how can that be? Weren't the Native Americans there first? And that sentence, if you think about it for a minute, like that is the core of the up for grabs of an ownership story. First is not a fact. So what the American courts did early on, they didn't say might makes right. They said first gets America, and the settlers are first, because what counts as first is first to chop down trees, first to clear away rocks, first to farm, first to basically make New England look like Old England. So what counted as first was a certain vision, a certain European vision of productive engagement with the land, producing in the way the Europeans did. And that was what was first. So Native Americans may have been there. They were not first owners because they tread lightly through the land. They were more hunter-gatherers. That wasn't strictly true. A lot of Native Americans were farmers. But that image of what they were doing on land is what led to, what is the basis for every single person here. Your title traces back on your home, traces back to that decision, which said that the Europeans were first, and they were first because of what they were doing on the land. First is always a story. Now, there's a might makes right component. That story of what counted as first had to be enforced by the sword, by multiple wars of settlers against Native Americans. But the legal justification that they came up with was that they were first. And that's true for kids on the playground, and that's true for gold miners in 1848 in California, and that's true for the Sooners in Oklahoma. It's all about capturing the definition of who was first.
I want to close out with a last question, just kind of throw you guys a curveball. Looking at the recent GameStop event that happened in the, I imagine you guys are familiar with the GameStop and how it basically a group of people on Reddit through their use of social media gamed the market and gamed traders. And this idea that what they did was somehow illegal, maybe, or unethical, or that there was some sort of, backdooring that they did into a marketplace using technology, and how that turned the market on its head. And this idea that there are sort of insiders in the market who have control over over who gets to trade in certain ways and outsiders, and that the outsiders sort of democratized access through technology. Because I think that has implications for how the economy is going to work going forward with the advent of technology that gives people more equal access to trading markets. So I wonder if you guys could comment on that.
Yeah, let me give a short comment, and Michael will probably want to expand. But I got to say, Lauren, this is why I love having you moderate our sessions, because there's such insightful questions. I mean, that's the point of our book, right? There are hidden rules that are going on with ownership, and people don't recognize them. And so, like the clickstream example that we used, right? 80% or something said, no, we should own our clickstreams. We don't, right? And people don't realize that that question is very much up for grabs right now. Insiders know that, but the rest of the population doesn't. And if they did, they could basically push that story and change the political valence of what's happening. And I think GameStop is a good example. Those folks understand the hidden rules of how Wall Street works, and they were able to take advantage of that, right? There's no question savvy businesses, governments, they know how ownership works, and they're using it to their benefit. And it's important that we understand that. Michael, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
That was a great answer. I mean, I guess maybe one last thought on that is that one thing that's so cool for me about GameStop is that it sort of ties in with what we're seeing at the frontiers of ownership all around, that we're moving to a much more online world. So most of the people, GameStop was basically a bunch of teenagers in their basement around the country trying to do a short squeeze, trying to squeeze a hedge fund that had shorted this stock to force it up and force them to cover their losses. It was a classic Wall Street strategy turned on its head. But what makes it work is this decentralized internet economy that we're moving to. And what's so unclear at the moment is what that's going to look like, what it's going to mean when our lives, when we no longer have I like to cook, and I have cookbooks from decades ago. When I turn to a recipe, I see the stains on the page, and it's very evocative for me. Like, what does it mean when we move to an online world when you don't have that cookbook, when you're just sort of scrolling through Grubhub and clicking? Like, my first car, I was so proud of that car. What does it mean when you just have Uber everywhere? Like, what does it mean to stream your life rather than own stuff? And I think there's something that we might lose from that switch to a world where we lose. I think there's actually a spiritual connection with our stuff that gets lost when it's just a stream of ones and zeros. So for me, what the GameStop question raises is like, what is it? What kind of a world are we moving into where it happens so fast, so online, in this sort of disembodied way? What does that actually mean for us as parents, as consumers, and really importantly, as citizens?
Well, that is a fantastic question to end on. I think this has been an incredible conversation. The chat has had an equally incredible parallel conversation going on. So for those of you whose questions didn't get answered, I have saved all the questions, and we'll be sending them to both professors in case they want to answer at a later point. And any further questions that you have, please feel free to email us at alumniacademy@yale.edu. And we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you all for your time today.
Thank you.